We have shut down our search and rescue mission. We don't see this as a search mission as much as we do a crime scene.
In the search for Nancy Guthrie and possibly someone being detained in the case. Investigators have blocked off a street in her neighborhood tonight. They're bringing in forensics and even a SWAT tactical vehicle. The mother of TV host Savannah Guthrie was kidnapped from her Tucson, Arizona home nearly 2 weeks ago.
So how long have you been living here?
I've been living in Tucson for about 36 years.
And you live around here?
I live about 15 minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes. So what do you think happened here? As you being a Tucson resident, what's your gut telling you?
My gut is telling me that it's the brother-in-law or the son-in-law.
Son-in-law. Why?
Just too many things. You know, he had pictures. There was a picture or two that came out, and you haven't seen him since. You haven't heard from him.
Radio silent.
The other people have, you know, the family, you know, Savannah and, you know, her brother and sister have done things. He hasn't been involved in any of it, and I don't know if he's trying to stay away from the limelight or what it is, but I can tell you this.
The night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, nothing looked broken. No shattered glass, no alarms screaming into the dark, no neighbors waking up to the sound of a struggle. What investigators eventually found instead was something stranger. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home suddenly stopped transmitting. 41 minutes later, another silent signal appeared. Nancy's pacemaker, an implanted medical device designed to monitor the rhythm of her heart, lost its Bluetooth connection. 2 timestamps, 2 quiet interruptions in the middle of the Arizona night. Between those 2 moments, an 84-year-old woman vanished from her own home. No one heard a scream. No one reported a break-in. No one saw a vehicle speeding away. And yet when the sun came up over the Catalina foothills the next morning, Nancy Guthrie was gone. That is where this story begins. Before we unravel what happened inside that house, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Bond, because the case you're about to hear is one of the most unsettling disappearances in recent American criminal history. A case where the evidence is precise, the timeline is narrow, and the answers remain just out of reach. To understand why this disappearance has captured national attention, you have to understand the woman at the center of it. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived in the Catalina foothills, a quiet area just outside Tucson, Arizona, where desert hills meet winding residential roads, and the nights are usually still. Neighbors described the neighborhood as peaceful. The kind of place where front gates are decorative rather than defensive. The kind of place where residents feel safe enough to keep routines that never change. Nancy had lived in the same home for decades. To the outside world, she was known primarily as the mother of television journalist Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. But to the people who knew her personally, Nancy was something else entirely. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a longtime member of her community. Despite her age, Nancy remained mentally sharp. Investigators later described her as a woman of sound mind, someone who managed her own routines and kept her independence. But physically, she was vulnerable. Nancy had difficulty walking. She relied on daily medication for heart-related conditions. She also had a pacemaker, a small medical device implanted to regulate her heartbeat. That device would later become one of the most important pieces of technology in the entire investigation. Because pacemakers do something most people never think about. They communicate. Modern pacemakers often transmit diagnostic information through Bluetooth connections, allowing physicians to monitor cardiac activity remotely. Which means when that connection disappears unexpectedly, it creates a timestamp. And timestamps can become evidence. Nancy's daily life followed patterns. Family visits, meals, quiet evenings at home. Nothing about her routine suggested danger. Nothing suggested she was being watched. Nothing suggested that somewhere in the darkness outside her home, someone might already be planning something. Because that is the unsettling reality investigators eventually confronted. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie did not appear to be random. It appeared to be deliberate. And deliberate crimes leave patterns. The night before she vanished was supposed to be completely ordinary. Nancy had spent time with family that evening. She was driven home by her son-in-law, Tomaso Cion, who according to reporting was the last person publicly known to have seen her alive. The drive from his house to Nancy's home took only minutes. Desert roads, minimal traffic, a short trip at the end of a normal evening. Nothing about that drive would have seemed unusual. Nothing about the moment when Nancy walked through her front gate would have suggested it was the last time anyone outside her house would see her. The house itself sat quietly among other homes in the foothills. A property with a gate, outdoor lighting, a doorbell camera mounted near the entrance. Technology that, in theory, should have captured anyone approaching the door. But theory and reality sometimes diverge, because what investigators later discovered about Nancy's camera system would complicate the timeline in ways few people initially realized. The cameras could detect motion. They could send alerts. But they were not continuously recording in the way many homeowners assume their systems do, which meant the most important minutes of that night would exist only as fragments, digital shadows, gaps between signals. And in those gaps, someone entered the story. The next morning began like any other. Sunlight spread across the desert. Neighbors started their routines. Traffic returned to the roads. But inside Nancy Guthrie's home, something was wrong. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no reply. At first, the silence might have seemed small. A missed call, an unanswered text, but silence can grow louder with every passing hour. Eventually, the realization arrived. Nancy was missing. When authorities were contacted later that day, the situation quickly escalated. An elderly woman with medical vulnerabilities had vanished overnight. That alone would have triggered concern. But when investigators began examining the digital timeline from the house, the concern deepened. Because the technology inside Nancy Guthrie's home had recorded two precise moments during the night, moments that would become the backbone of the investigation. 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., two quiet disruptions, 41 minutes apart. Investigators believe that somewhere inside that window, Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home against her will. What happened during those 41 minutes remains the central mystery of the case. But as the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. Someone had been at Nancy's door that night. Someone who understood the camera mounted beside it. Someone who approached the house in darkness. And someone who left behind just enough evidence to create questions, but not enough to provide answers. Those questions would soon spread far beyond Tucson. Because once the public learned who Nancy Guthrie was, the disappearance transformed into a national story. Television networks covered the case. News outlets followed every development, and millions of people began examining every image released by investigators, searching for details, searching for clues, searching for the identity of the person who appeared briefly on camera outside Nancy's door. A figure in dark clothing, face concealed, movement calm and deliberate. The image was short, but it was enough to ignite speculation, enough to ignite fear. Because the moment investigators released that footage, the case changed. The search for Nancy Guthrie became the search for the man on the porch. And the deeper investigators looked into that moment, the more unsettling the timeline became. Because whoever approached that house at 1:47 in the morning did not appear lost. He did not appear confused. He walked directly toward the camera. And the way he moved suggested something investigators would later consider carefully. The possibility that the person at Nancy Guthrie's door did not choose that house by accident. But that part of the story comes later, because before we examine the figure on the porch, we have to return to the hours before Nancy disappeared. To the last ordinary evening. To the moment when she stepped through her front gate and into the house where the night would unfold. And to the quiet stretch of desert darkness that followed. A stretch of time where nothing seemed unusual, until suddenly, everything was. The evening before Nancy Guthrie disappeared began the way countless evenings in Tucson begin. Warm air settled over the Catalina foothills as the sun dipped behind the desert mountains. The sky shifted from gold to purple, and the quiet roads that wound through the neighborhood carried only the occasional passing car. For Nancy Guthrie, it had been a normal day. There had been no emergency calls, no threats. No warning signs suggesting anything unusual was about to unfold. The evening had been spent with family. For people who knew Nancy well, that detail matters. Because family gatherings were a routine part of her life, dinner visits were common. Conversations stretched across the table the way they do in households where familiarity has been built over decades. Nothing about that night suggested danger. Nancy's family had every reason to believe the evening would end the same way it always did. With a drive home. With the porch light turning on. With the front door closing quietly behind her. According to public reporting, Nancy was driven home that night by her son-in-law, Tomaso Cion. He had been part of the family for years, married to Nancy's daughter Annie. For investigators later reviewing the timeline, this moment would become an important marker, not because it suggested wrongdoing, but because it was the last confirmed moment anyone could place Nancy alive. The drive itself was short. Only a few miles separated the two homes. The roads connecting them curved through the Catalina foothills, past desert brush and quiet residential streets where nighttime traffic was almost non-existent. When the car arrived at Nancy's house, the routine continued. She exited the vehicle, walked toward the front gate, and entered the property she had lived in for decades. To the outside observer, nothing about that moment would have seemed significant. There were no witnesses reporting suspicious activity, no vehicles circling the block, no unfamiliar figures standing near the gate. Just an elderly woman returning home after dinner. Investigators would later say Nancy was believed to have arrived home around 9:50 p.m. Inside the house, the evening likely unfolded the same way it always had. Lights on, doors closed. The quiet rituals that mark the end of a day. In the hours that followed, Tucson settled into the stillness that often blankets desert cities after midnight. Traffic thinned. Street noise faded. The foothills became silent. For Nancy, the night had likely become routine. Perhaps she prepared medications. Perhaps she watched television. Perhaps she simply settled into the quiet comfort of a house she had known for years. No one knows the exact details of what happened inside the home between 10 p.m. and midnight. But investigators believe nothing unusual occurred during those early hours. The timeline remains calm, predictable, ordinary. And that normality would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because when a crime unfolds in chaos, witnesses remember noise. They remember shouting. They remember something breaking. But when a crime unfolds quietly, the absence of disturbance can become its own mystery. Nancy's home showed no immediate signs of forced entry. No shattered windows, no splintered doors, no neighbors reporting sounds of struggle. For investigators reviewing the case later, that detail raised difficult questions. If someone entered the house, how did they do it without drawing attention? If someone confronted Nancy, how did it happen without alerting anyone nearby? The quietness of the night seemed to swallow whatever had occurred inside those walls. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The foothills remained still. But somewhere within that silence, the timeline began to shift. Investigators now believe that sometime after Nancy returned home, someone approached the property. Not during the early evening, not during the hours when neighbors might still be awake, but later, in the deep part of the night when most of the neighborhood would have been asleep. The house itself had security features. There was a gate at the front of the property. There were cameras. There were outdoor lights designed to illuminate the entrance. These details are important, because they shape the central question investigators continue to examine. Did someone approach the house without understanding those security measures? Or did someone approach knowing exactly how they worked? That distinction matters. A random burglar might stumble upon cameras and panic. A person familiar with the house might walk toward them calmly. At this stage of the timeline, there is still no evidence confirming what the intruder knew. But what investigators do know is that the next significant moment in the case happened nearly 4 hours after Nancy arrived home. During that time, the neighborhood remained quiet. No calls were made to emergency services. No neighbors reported suspicious movement. No alarms were triggered. Then, shortly before 2 a.m., the silence changed. The first signal arrived at 1:47 a.m. Nancy's doorbell camera, mounted at the front of the house, suddenly stopped transmitting. For many homeowners, this might not immediately raise alarm. Technology fails. Internet connections drop. But in an investigation like this one, every digital interruption becomes meaningful because timing matters. And the timing of this disruption placed it directly inside the window. Investigators now believe the crime began. The camera did not simply lose power randomly during the day. It went offline in the middle of the night, and it happened at the exact moment investigators believe someone approached Nancy's door. The footage released later by the FBI would show a masked figure standing near the entrance. But in the earliest moments of the investigation, authorities did not yet know who that person was. They only knew the camera had stopped transmitting. After that moment, the house went silent again. But the silence would not last long, because the second timestamp was coming, and that second timestamp would deepen the mystery even further. 1 minute after the camera signal disappeared, another piece of technology inside Nancy's home recorded something unusual. Her pacemaker connections stopped communicating. The timestamp for that disruption appeared at 2:28 a.m. Pacemakers are not typically connected to criminal investigations, but in this case, the device created a digital boundary, a moment when the connection between Nancy and the outside monitoring system suddenly vanished. To investigators, that moment suggested something important. Nancy was no longer within the environment where her device could communicate normally, which means that sometime between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., something happened inside the house. Something significant enough to interrupt two separate pieces of technology: a camera at the front door and a medical device connected to Nancy's heart. Between those two signals lies the most important window in the entire case: 41 minutes. That is the estimated period. Investigators believe someone may have entered Nancy's home, confronted her, and removed her from the property. What happened during those 41 minutes is still unknown. But the timeline created by those signals tells investigators something critical. The event was not instantaneous. It took time. Time spent inside the house. Time long enough for investigators to believe the person involved was not acting randomly. The person at Nancy Guthrie's door that night stayed long enough for the crime to unfold. And when the house fell silent again after 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie was gone. Morning would come hours later. Neighbors would wake. The sun would rise over the desert. But the most important part of the story had already happened. Inside the house, in the darkness between two timestamps. When the digital signals stopped, and an 84-year-old woman vanished without a trace, the next stage of the investigation would reveal something investigators had not yet seen. An image. A short piece of video captured before the camera stopped transmitting. A glimpse of the person standing outside Nancy's door that night. A figure wearing dark clothing. A mask covering most of the face. A backpack visible on the shoulders. That image would soon spread across news networks and social media. And the search for Nancy Guthrie would become something larger. Because once the public saw the person on the porch, the mystery gained a face. A faceless one. And the next chapter of the story would revolve around that image. The moment investigators released it. And the questions that followed. Questions about who that person was. Why they approached Nancy's home. And what they did during those 41 minutes when the house went silent. There are moments in criminal investigations that become permanent reference points. A phone call. A door opening. A camera turning on. In the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, that moment is 1:47 in the morning. Because at exactly that time, the technology mounted at the front of Nancy's home recorded something investigators would later examine frame by frame. A figure appeared on the porch. Dark clothing. A mask. A backpack visible against the shoulders. The video lasted only seconds. But those seconds changed everything. When investigators first examined the footage, they were not looking for dramatic clues. They were looking for routine explanations. A delivery driver. A neighbor. Someone approaching the house by mistake. But the movement in the video did not resemble someone knocking on a door. The person did not hesitate. Did not appear confused. Did not step back as though realizing they had come to the wrong house. Instead, the individual walked directly toward the camera. Calm. Deliberate. The way someone moves when they already know where everything is. In the video, The figure approaches the doorbell camera itself. One hand reaches forward. For a brief moment, the camera captures the outline of the glove covering that hand. Then the lens goes dark. That is the moment the doorbell camera stops transmitting. The exact timestamp investigators later identified as 1:47 a.m. After that instant, whatever happened on the porch was no longer visible. But the seconds before the signal disappeared provided investigators with the only visual evidence connected to the night Nancy Guthrie vanished. When the FBI eventually released images from that video to the public, the reaction was immediate. News outlets across the country aired the footage. Online forums began examining every movement. People paused the video, zoomed into still frames, studied the person's posture, the way the shoulders moved, the way the figure stepped across the porch. Even the way the backpack hung from the body became a point of discussion. Investigators released a basic physical description of the individual. A male, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall. Average build, wearing dark clothing, a mask covering most of the face, carrying a black backpack identified as an Ozark Trail hiker pack. That description created the first tangible image connected to the case. But it did not create answers, because the footage itself revealed almost nothing about identity. The mask concealed facial features. The clothing appeared generic. The backpack was the kind sold in retail stores across the country. Everything about the appearance seemed designed to avoid recognition. But investigators noticed something else in the video. Something subtle. The way the figure moved through the frame. The person did not appear hurried. Did not appear uncertain. There was no visible attempt to hide from the camera. No hesitation before stepping onto the porch. No visible surprise at the presence of the device mounted beside the door. Instead, the person approached the camera as though they already expected it to be there. And that detail would become one of the most discussed elements of the footage. Because when someone approaches a house they have never visited before, cameras tend to draw attention. People glance toward them. People slow down. People adjust their position. But the person in the video walked straight toward the lens, reached forward, and ended the recording. For investigators, that raised the possibility that the individual understood exactly where the camera was located. That possibility does not prove familiarity with the house, but it suggests awareness. And awareness changes the way investigators interpret behavior. If someone knew where the camera was mounted, the next question becomes obvious. Did they also know how the rest of the house was arranged? At the moment the camera stopped transmitting, the only evidence available was the short clip captured before the signal ended. Everything that happened afterward unfolded beyond the reach of the lens, but technology inside the house continued quietly recording data. And that data would eventually reveal something else. Because after the doorbell camera went dark at 1:47 a.m., the next recorded signal would not appear until 2:28 a.m. 41 minutes later. Investigators would eventually focus on that time span more than any other part of the night, because the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie appears to have occurred within that exact window. The person seen in the video did not appear on the porch for only a few seconds. The timeline suggests the individual remained in the area long enough for events inside the house to unfold. What those events were remains unknown. But investigators have studied the possibilities carefully. An 84-year-old woman living alone inside a gated home. A masked individual approaching the entrance in the middle of the night. A camera that stops transmitting seconds after the person reaches it. And a 41-minute gap before the next technological signal. When investigators reconstruct scenarios from evidence like this, they consider the practical realities of the situation. Entering the house, finding Nancy, controlling the situation without alerting neighbors, moving through the home, and leaving the property. Each of those actions takes time, and the 41-minute window provides enough time for a deliberate sequence of events, but not so much time that the person could remain indefinitely, which means whatever happened inside the house was likely completed before 2:28 a.m. That moment matters because it corresponds with the second digital interruption in the timeline. Nancy's pacemaker connection. When the Bluetooth signal from the device stopped transmitting, it indicated Nancy was no longer within the environment where the connection normally functioned. That signal alone does not explain what happened. But when combined with the earlier camera disruption, it creates a pattern. Two pieces of technology stopped communicating within the same narrow time frame. The doorbell camera first, the pacemaker later. Between those two signals lies the moment investigators believe Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. The image of the masked figure on the porch is the only visual trace of that night. And the more investigators studied the video, the more they focused on the small details embedded within it. The backpack, the clothing, the height estimate, the posture. Each element offered the possibility of identification, but each also carried uncertainty, because masks and clothing obscure more than they reveal. Even the backpack, which appeared distinctive in the footage, could not immediately be traced to a specific person. Retail backpacks of that type are widely sold. Thousands exist, perhaps tens of thousands. And without a clear image of the person wearing it, the backpack became more symbol than evidence. Still, investigators released the images publicly, because sometimes recognition comes from unexpected places. A neighbor noticing a familiar item, a friend recognizing a posture, a stranger remembering a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. The hope behind releasing the footage was simple. Someone, somewhere, might recognize the person on that porch. But recognition can move in unexpected directions. Because when millions of people examine the same image, interpretations multiply. Online discussions began appearing within hours of the video's release. People compared the figure's walk, the length of each step, the way the shoulders shifted as the person moved across the porch. Others examined the backpack frame by frame, looking for markings, reflective strips, anything that might distinguish it from thousands of similar bags. Some observers focused on the person's height, trying to measure proportions against the doorframe, trying to determine whether the estimate released by investigators was accurate. But height estimates based on security footage are rarely precise. Angles distort perception. Camera placement alters proportions. And investigators often provide ranges rather than exact measurements. Still, the number remained important. 5'9", 5'10", average build. That description created a profile, a starting point, but not a name. And the most important part of the footage remained unchanged. The person approached the house with purpose, reached toward the camera, and disappeared from view. What happened next is known only through the technology that continued recording signals inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Because while the camera had gone dark, the timeline had not. 41 minutes later, the pacemaker connection ended. And by the time investigators began reconstructing the events of that night, Nancy Guthrie had already vanished into the desert darkness, beyond the reach of every camera on that street. The figure on the porch remains the only image tied directly to the moment her disappearance began. An anonymous presence standing at the door of a quiet house in the Catalina foothills. A house that, minutes later, would fall completely silent. And the investigation into that image would soon raise a new set of questions. Questions not only about the person captured on video, but about what happened after the camera stopped recording, and whether anyone else might have been involved in the events unfolding inside the house during those 41 minutes. Because the deeper investigators looked into the timeline, the more complex the case began to appear. And the next chapter of the story would reveal how the search for Nancy Guthrie expanded far beyond the porch, where the camera went dark, into ransom messages, public appeals, and a national search that would grow larger with every passing day. The desert morning arrived quietly over the Catalina foothills. Sunlight crept over the mountains, washing the quiet neighborhoods of Tucson in pale gold. The air carried the same stillness that had settled over the city during the night. Nothing about the landscape suggested that anything unusual had occurred. The streets looked ordinary. The houses looked ordinary. But inside one home, the silence was different. Because sometime during the night, Nancy Guthrie had vanished. The first signs that something was wrong did not come from neighbors. They came from absence. Phone calls that went unanswered. Messages that received no reply. For families with aging relatives, that kind of silence can feel unsettling quickly. When someone who normally responds stops responding, concern grows with every passing hour. At first, it may have seemed small. A delay. Perhaps Nancy was sleeping late. Perhaps she had stepped outside. Perhaps she simply had not heard the phone. But as the morning continued, the silence stretched longer than usual. And eventually, the possibility no one wants to consider began to take shape. Something was wrong. When family members attempted to reach Nancy and received no response, concern deepened. The house that had seemed so secure only hours earlier now felt strangely unreachable. Calls continued. Still nothing. Eventually, the decision was made to check on her. By the time authorities became involved later that day, the situation had already shifted from uncertainty to alarm. Nancy Guthrie was missing. When investigators first approached the home, they did not yet know the timeline that would later emerge. At that moment, they were responding to what appeared to be a missing elderly person. But even in those earliest hours, certain details immediately raised questions. The house itself did not appear disturbed. Doors were not broken. Windows were intact. Nothing suggested the kind of violent intrusion that typically accompanies a forced abduction. That detail alone created a puzzle. Because Nancy was 84 years old, her mobility was limited. She relied on medications that she normally kept within reach. It was unlikely she would leave her home voluntarily in the middle of the night. And if she had left unexpectedly, someone should have seen her. But no one had. The neighborhood was quiet. No witnesses had reported seeing Nancy walking along the street. No one had reported hearing shouting or alarms. The absence of obvious disturbance forced investigators to consider a difficult possibility. If Nancy had been taken, whoever took her had done so quietly. Quietly enough that no one nearby noticed. Investigators began examining the house carefully. Inside, certain details stood out. Nancy's medications were still present. For someone dependent on daily medication, leaving without them would be unusual. That fact alone suggested Nancy had not planned to go anywhere, which meant whatever had happened likely occurred suddenly. But sudden events still leave traces. Footprints. Damage. Signs of struggle. In Nancy's home, those traces were limited. The lack of visible damage made the case unusual from the beginning. And unusual cases often force investigators to rely on something else. Technology. Digital systems. Devices quietly recording activity in the background. That is when the doorbell camera timeline became critical. Because investigators reviewing the home's electronic records soon discovered the first timestamp that would define the investigation. 1:47 a.m. That was when the doorbell camera stopped transmitting. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as a technical glitch. Home networks fail. Internet signals drop. Devices disconnect. But when investigators continued reviewing the system data, they discovered something that made the moment impossible to ignore. Shortly before the camera stopped transmitting, the system had detected motion at the front of the house. That motion detection suggested someone had approached the property, and once investigators began examining that moment more closely, they discovered the short clip that captured the masked figure on the porch. The image of the person approaching Nancy's door would soon become the central visual element of the investigation. But during the early hours of the case, investigators were still piecing together the sequence of events. They knew the camera had stopped transmitting. They knew someone had approached the porch, but they did not yet know what had happened afterward. Then another piece of technology provided the next clue: Nancy's pacemaker. Pacemakers are medical devices designed to regulate the rhythm of the heart. Many modern versions communicate periodically with monitoring systems through wireless connections. When those connections disappear, the system records the moment. Nancy's pacemaker lost its Bluetooth connection at 2:28 a.m. That timestamp immediately caught investigators' attention, because it occurred 41 minutes after the doorbell camera stopped transmitting. The connection between those two signals created a narrow window in which something significant had occurred. Between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., investigators began analyzing what might have happened during those 41 minutes. Could Nancy have left the house on her own? The possibility seemed unlikely. Her medications remained inside. Her physical condition made long-distance walking difficult. And no one had reported seeing her outside. Could the pacemaker signal have been interrupted by a technical failure? Possible. But when combined with the earlier camera disruption and the motion detected at the front door, the pattern suggested something more deliberate. Two separate technologies had stopped communicating within the same small window of time. The simplest explanation was that Nancy had been removed from the environment where those systems normally operated. In other words, she was no longer inside the house. That conclusion transformed the investigation. The case was no longer simply a missing person report. It now carried the hallmarks of a possible abduction. Authorities began expanding the search. Investigators canvassed the surrounding neighborhood. Officers spoke with residents. Security cameras from nearby homes were reviewed. Vehicles moving through nearby streets during the early morning hours became points of interest. Every possible witness was considered. But in quiet, residential neighborhoods, the middle of the night often leaves very little behind. Most people are asleep. Traffic is minimal. Street activity disappears. The desert darkness swallows movement that might be obvious during the day. For investigators, the lack of witnesses meant the case would depend heavily on digital evidence. Doorbell cameras, traffic cameras, security systems from neighboring houses. Any technology that might have recorded a fragment of what happened after Nancy's camera stopped transmitting. Meanwhile, the family was facing a different reality. The realization that someone they loved had disappeared. Savannah Guthrie, known to millions through her work on national television, suddenly found herself living a story she had spent years reporting on. But this was no longer journalism. This was personal. Family members began speaking publicly about the disappearance. Appeals for information were made. People across the country began hearing Nancy's name. The case quickly expanded beyond Tucson. National media coverage brought intense attention to the investigation. Images of the masked figure from the doorbell camera appeared on television broadcasts. Online discussions multiplied. Millions of viewers saw the same few seconds of footage, and every viewer asked the same question. Who was the person standing on Nancy Guthrie's porch at 1:47 in the morning? The image became the defining symbol of the case. A figure captured for only moments before the camera signal disappeared. A person whose identity remained completely hidden. But investigators understood something important about that image. It represented only the beginning. Because whatever happened on the porch was only the first step in the timeline. The real events unfolded inside the house. During those 41 minutes between the two technological signals. What occurred during that time remains one of the most critical unanswered questions in the investigation. Did the person enter the home alone? Did Nancy open the door willingly? Was she confronted immediately? Or was she surprised inside the house by someone who already knew how to move through it? Those questions remain unanswered. But the morning Nancy was discovered missing changed the direction of the investigation permanently. Because once investigators confirmed that she had likely been taken during the night, the search expanded rapidly. Local authorities were soon joined by federal investigators. The FBI became involved. And the case began evolving into something far larger than a local missing-to-person investigation. Search teams examined the surrounding desert. Vehicles leaving the area during the early morning hours were analyzed. Technology experts studied the camera system. And investigators began examining a new possibility. The possibility that the disappearance had been planned. That the person approaching the porch had not arrived by chance, but had come prepared. Prepared to disable the camera. Prepared to enter the house, prepared to leave with Nancy Guthrie before anyone realized what had happened. As the investigation widened, more pieces of information began to surface. Details about the suspect's appearance, details about the equipment visible in the video, details that would lead investigators to ask new questions about the person who appeared outside Nancy's door. Questions about the backpack, the clothing, the posture, and the calm, deliberate way the figure approached the camera. Because the deeper investigators studied the video, the more they began to focus on something subtle, not just who the person might be, but how they moved, and what that movement might reveal about their familiarity with the house where Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The next chapter of the investigation would focus on that footage in greater detail, and the closer investigators looked at the man on the porch, the more they began to wonder whether the person standing there might have known far more about that house than anyone initially realized. The image that defined the Nancy Guthrie investigation lasted only a few seconds. It was not dramatic. There was no chase, no shouting, no visible confrontation, just a single figure standing on the porch of a quiet house in the Catalina foothills in the middle of the night. Yet those few seconds would become the most analyzed piece of footage in the entire case, because that image may represent the last moment before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. When investigators released the video to the public, the clip immediately became the centerpiece of the investigation. The footage showed a person approaching Nancy's front door shortly before the camera stopped transmitting. The individual appeared to be male. Average height, average build. Dressed in dark clothing that blended easily with the nighttime surroundings. The person's face was concealed behind a mask, but a few details were still visible. A backpack rested against the person's shoulders. Gloves covered the hands, and beneath the mask, investigators believed there might have been facial hair, possibly a mustache or goatee. Those details became the official description released by the FBI. Male. Approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall. Average build. Dark clothing. Black backpack. Mask covering the face. Gloves. The description created the first recognizable outline connected to the case. But outlines do not identify people. They only narrow possibilities. The backpack quickly became one of the most discussed elements in the footage. Investigators described it as an Ozark Trail hiker pack, a style of backpack sold widely in retail stores across the United States. Outdoor gear. Affordable. Common. Thousands of identical backpacks exist across the country, which meant the bag alone could not identify the person wearing it. Still, investigators hoped that someone might recognize the combination of details. The clothing, the backpack, the posture. Sometimes the smallest detail can trigger recognition. A friend noticing the way someone walks. A neighbor recognizing a piece of clothing. A coworker remembering something that seemed unimportant before. That possibility is one of the reasons law enforcement releases surveillance footage in cases like this. Because investigators know something the public sometimes forgets. A person can hide their face, but they cannot easily hide their habits. The way they walk, the way they stand, the way they move through space. Those details often remain consistent even when someone attempts to conceal their identity. In the Nancy Guthrie footage, the person's movement drew almost as much attention as the clothing. The figure did not appear hurried. There was no visible sign of panic, no sign that the person expected to be interrupted. Instead, the individual moved with a steady rhythm across the porch. Step. Pause. Step again. The posture remained relaxed, almost casual. And that calm movement raised questions for investigators. Because someone attempting a random burglary often behaves differently. They look around. They hesitate. They test doors cautiously. But the person in the footage did none of those things. The individual walked directly toward the camera, reached forward, and then, the signal disappeared. The motion itself was brief, but the implications were significant. Disabling a camera is not something most people think about when approaching a house. But the person in the footage appeared to understand exactly where the camera was mounted. And that detail led investigators to consider an important question. Did the person approach the house expecting the camera to be there? Or did they discover it only when they stepped onto the porch? The answer to that question could change how investigators interpret the entire event. If the person already knew the camera was present, that knowledge might suggest familiarity with the property. If they did not know about the camera beforehand, their reaction would likely appear different, more hesitant, more surprised. The footage itself cannot answer that question definitively, but the person's behavior remains one of the most carefully examined aspects of the video. Another detail investigators studied was the timing. The figure appeared shortly before the camera stopped transmitting at 1:47 a.m. After that moment, the camera recorded nothing. No additional footage. No movement leaving the porch. Which means whatever happened next occurred outside the camera's view. But the timeline suggests the person did not simply walk away, because the second technological signal in the investigation the pacemaker connection, would disappear 41 minutes later. That gap in time suggests the individual remained in the area long enough for events inside the house to unfold. The footage therefore represents the beginning of the timeline, not the end. And that realization changed how investigators approached the video. Instead of viewing the image as the final moment captured by the camera, they began viewing it as the first step in a sequence of events that occurred inside the home, a sequence that likely lasted long enough for someone to enter the house, locate Nancy, and leave with her. But the video itself reveals none of that. All it shows is the approach, a masked figure standing at the door of a quiet house, a gloved hand reaching toward the lens, and then darkness. When the FBI released the images publicly, the reaction was immediate. Millions of people across the country saw the same few frames. The masked figure became a symbol of the case. A person without a name. A silhouette connected to one of the most puzzling disappearances in recent memory. Online discussions began analyzing every aspect of the video. Some viewers focused on the person's height. Others examined the backpack more closely. The reflective strips on the bag. The shape of the straps. Even the placement of the holster visible beneath the jacket became a point of debate, because in one portion of the footage, observers believed they could see what appeared to be a firearm holster positioned across the person's body. If accurate, that detail would suggest the individual arrived prepared for confrontation. But the resolution of the footage makes certainty difficult. Security cameras capture motion. They rarely capture fine detail. And investigators must be careful not to draw conclusions that the evidence cannot support. What the video clearly shows is simpler. A person approached the house. The person disabled the camera. And sometime during the 41 minutes that followed, Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Investigators continued studying the footage carefully. Height estimates were refined. Movement patterns examined. Experts sometimes review surveillance footage to evaluate posture, gait, and body proportions. But even the most advanced analysis cannot transform a masked figure into a confirmed identity. Without facial recognition, investigators must rely on other evidence: digital records, witness reports, vehicle sightings. Technology captured only part of the story that night. The rest would have to be reconstructed through investigation. And as the search for Nancy Guthrie continued, another layer of the case began to emerge: ransom messages, public appeals, and a rapidly growing national spotlight. Because once the image of the man on the porch spread across the country, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was no longer just a local investigation. It had become a story followed by millions. A story filled with questions. Who was the person in the video? Why did they approach Nancy's home? What happened during the 41 minutes after the camera went dark? And most importantly, where was Nancy Guthrie now? As investigators searched for answers, the case entered its next phase, one that would involve the possibility of ransom, public pleas from Nancy's family, and the growing pressure on law enforcement to solve a disappearance that had already captured the attention of the entire nation. Because while the image of the masked figure raised questions, it also introduced a new fear: the possibility that Nancy Guthrie had not simply disappeared, but had been taken. And if that was true, the next question investigators had to answer was even more urgent. What did the person on the porch want? In the days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the investigation expanded beyond the quiet streets of the Catalina foothills. Search teams moved through desert terrain surrounding the neighborhood. Investigators canvassed nearby homes. Surveillance footage from surrounding streets was collected and examined. Every vehicle passing through the area during the early morning hours of February 1st became a point of interest. At the same time, another reality was unfolding. Nancy's disappearance was no longer a local story. The case was being reported across the country. Television broadcasts showed the image of the masked figure approaching her door. Newspapers printed Nancy's photograph. Online discussions spread the footage to millions of viewers. And with that attention came a growing pressure on investigators to find answers quickly. Because when a person disappears under circumstances suggesting abduction, time becomes one of the most important factors in the entire case. Every hour that passes reduces the chances of locating the victim quickly. Every day that passes increases the difficulty of reconstructing the events that occurred. For Nancy's family, those hours carried a different weight. The disappearance was not just a criminal investigation, it was personal. Savannah Guthrie, known across the country as a journalist, suddenly found herself facing the nightmare scenario she had reported on many times before. Except this time, the victim was her mother. Family members began speaking publicly about the disappearance. Appeals were made for anyone with information to come forward. Television interviews were given, messages were posted online. Each appeal carried the same message. If someone knew anything about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, investigators needed to hear it. But alongside the public appeals, another element of the case began to emerge. Reports surfaced suggesting ransom communications connected to the disappearance. Details surrounding those communications were limited. Law enforcement rarely releases specific information about ransom demands during an active investigation. Doing so can interfere with negotiations or compromise investigative strategy. But the possibility of ransom introduced a new dimension to the case. Because ransom implies motive. If someone demanded money in exchange for Nancy's safety, the crime would fall into a familiar pattern: kidnapping for financial gain. Yet investigators must always approach ransom claims carefully. Sometimes ransom demands are genuine. Sometimes they are hoaxes. And sometimes they are attempts to mislead investigators. In high-profile cases, false ransom communications can appear quickly. People seeking attention, individuals attempting to exploit the situation, or someone attempting to confuse investigators about the true nature of the crime, which means every communication must be examined carefully. Digital evidence, metadata, timing, the language used in the messages, all of these details become part of the investigation. Meanwhile, the search for Nancy Guthrie continued. Investigators expanded their efforts beyond the immediate neighborhood. Helicopters scanned areas of desert terrain. Search teams examined remote locations where someone might attempt to conceal evidence. The terrain surrounding Tucson is vast. Miles of desert landscape stretch in every direction. Rocky hills, dry washes, open ground where vehicles can disappear quickly after leaving residential streets. That geography creates challenges for investigators. It provides countless possible routes someone could take while leaving the area during the early morning hours. And that reality meant investigators had to examine more than just the house where Nancy disappeared. They had to examine everything that happened after the person left the porch. Traffic cameras became critical. Vehicles captured on nearby streets during the early morning hours were reviewed. Security cameras from neighboring homes were examined frame by frame. Investigators hoped to identify a vehicle that might have passed through the area shortly after 2:28 a.m., the moment Nancy's pacemaker connection disappeared. If someone removed Nancy from the house, they almost certainly needed transportation, which meant somewhere along the surrounding roads, a vehicle might have been captured on camera. The challenge was scale. Even in quiet neighborhoods, vehicles moved through the area overnight. Residents returning home, delivery drivers, late-night travelers. Every car appearing on nearby cameras had to be evaluated, and each evaluation required time. While investigators worked through that process, Nancy's family continued making public appeals. Those appeals carried a mixture of hope and desperation. Hope that someone might recognize the person in the footage. Hope that someone might remember a suspicious vehicle. Hope that the person responsible might come forward. But desperation as well. Because each passing day without answers deepened the uncertainty. And uncertainty can be one of the most difficult experiences for families of missing persons. Not knowing what happened, not knowing where a loved one might be, not knowing whether the next phone call will bring answers, or more silence. As the case entered its third week, the Guthrie family made a major announcement. They would offer a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's safe return. The reward was significant. $1 million, a sum large enough to capture attention across the country. Rewards of that size serve a specific purpose. They encourage people to come forward with information they might otherwise keep to themselves. Someone who noticed something unusual. Someone who saw a vehicle leaving the area. Someone who recognized the backpack or clothing seen in the surveillance footage. Even the smallest detail can sometimes break open a case. and investigators hoped the reward would motivate people who had not yet spoken to contact authorities. The announcement of the reward renewed public attention on the investigation. News outlets repeated the description of the masked figure. Images from the porch footage circulated again. Millions of viewers revisited the same short clip, searching for details, searching for clues, searching for something investigators might have missed. But despite the intense attention, the central mystery remained unchanged. The identity of the person seen approaching Nancy Guthrie's door at 1:47 a.m. was still unknown, and the 41 minutes that followed remained unexplained. Investigators continued working quietly behind the scenes. Evidence collected from Nancy's home was analyzed. Digital data from devices inside the house was examined. Forensic testing continued. Each piece of information added another small fragment to the overall picture. But cases like this rarely move in a straight line. Investigations unfold through layers. Evidence leads to new questions. New questions lead to new searches. And sometimes the most important clues appear long after the initial event. For investigators, patience becomes essential. Because while public attention often focuses on dramatic developments, real investigations are built on careful examination. Every record, every digital signal, every frame of video, everything connected to the timeline of the disappearance must be examined. And as the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continued, another question began to emerge. A question that investigators could not ignore. Was the person seen on the porch acting alone? Or was there someone else involved? Because when investigators reconstruct crimes involving abduction, they often consider the practical realities of the situation. Entering a house, controlling a victim, moving through a property, leaving without being seen. Those actions can be carried out by a single individual. But sometimes the evidence suggests something different. Sometimes the evidence suggests coordination. And as the timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance became clearer, investigators began examining that possibility carefully, not as a conclusion, but as a question that would influence the next stage of the investigation. Because if more than one person had been involved in the events of that night, it would change how investigators interpreted every piece of evidence collected so far. And the deeper they looked into the timeline, the more complex the case began to appear. Which brings us to the next chapter of the story. The evidence investigators believed might matter most, and the clues that, at first, seemed to point in one direction before the investigation revealed something very different. In high-profile investigations, certain pieces of evidence quickly capture public attention. Sometimes, they appear to offer a breakthrough, a clue that seems to connect the timeline, a detail that appears to reveal who might be responsible. But investigations rarely move that cleanly. Because the first explanation for a piece of evidence is not always the correct one. And in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, one discovery briefly seemed like it might become the key to solving the case. A glove. The object itself was simple, dark material, discarded along a roadway roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home. For investigators, the location immediately raised questions. 2 miles is close enough to suggest a possible connection to the events that occurred during the early morning hours of February 1st. But it is also far enough away that the object could have been unrelated. Objects appear along roadsides every day. Clothing, trash, lost belongings. And most of them have nothing to do with criminal investigations. Still, investigators could not ignore the possibility that the glove had been discarded by someone connected to the disappearance. If the person seen on Nancy's porch had worn gloves, it would make sense for those gloves to be discarded afterward. Gloves are often used during crimes to avoid leaving fingerprints. Once removed, they become evidence themselves, and criminals sometimes dispose of them quickly to eliminate that evidence, which meant the glove found near the road required careful examination. Forensic testing began. DNA analysis. Material analysis. Investigators hoped the glove might contain biological evidence capable of identifying the person who wore it. In many modern investigations, DNA evidence becomes one of the most powerful tools available to law enforcement. A single biological trace can sometimes lead investigators directly to a suspect, or at least to a genetic relative connected through genealogy databases. For a brief period, the discovery of the glove generated intense speculation. People following the case believed it might contain the identity of the person seen on Nancy's porch. But forensic investigations move carefully. Evidence must be examined thoroughly before conclusions are made. And when the results of the testing were finally understood, the answer was unexpected. The DNA recovered from the glove did not belong to a suspect connected to the disappearance. Instead, investigators traced the DNA to a local restaurant worker who had no connection to Nancy Guthrie or the investigation. The glove, it turned out, had nothing to do with the case. What had appeared to be a promising lead was simply an unrelated object discarded near the road. Moments like that can be frustrating during investigations. A clue that seems important suddenly collapses. A path investigators hoped might lead somewhere instead leads nowhere. But those moments are also part of the investigative process, because eliminating false leads allows investigators to focus on evidence that truly matters. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the discovery of the glove briefly captured public attention. But once the DNA results were confirmed, the investigation moved past it. The glove was removed from the list of potential clues. The search for answers returned to the house where Nancy had disappeared, and to the timeline that still defined the investigation. 1:47 a.m. The camera stopped transmitting. 2:28 a.m. Nancy's pacemaker lost its connection. Those two timestamps remained the most reliable anchors investigators had. Between those moments lay the 41 minutes that still needed explanation. While the glove lead faded, other areas of the investigation continued moving forward. Forensic analysis of evidence collected inside Nancy's home continued. Investigators examined biological traces, surfaces, objects that might reveal whether someone had entered the house. DNA evidence collected from inside the property became a focus of the investigation. Unlike the glove, this evidence was connected directly to the location where Nancy had disappeared. But DNA evidence can be complex. Sometimes samples contain mixtures from multiple individuals. Sometimes the amount of material is extremely small. And sometimes the results require extensive laboratory work before any conclusions can be reached. Investigators also began exploring another modern investigative method: genetic genealogy. This technique allows investigators to compare DNA samples against large public databases containing genetic information voluntarily submitted by individuals researching family history. If a partial match appears in those databases, investigators can begin constructing family trees. Eventually, those trees may lead to a person whose DNA matches the sample collected at a crime scene. The technique has helped solve numerous cold cases in recent years. But it also requires patience. Building genetic family trees can take weeks or months. And the results depend on whether relatives of the unknown individual have submitted their DNA to public databases. While forensic work continued, investigators also continued examining the digital evidence connected to the case. Doorbell cameras from nearby homes, traffic cameras from surrounding streets, vehicles appearing in the area during the early morning hours of February 1st. Every frame of video captured during that time period had the potential to provide another piece of the puzzle. Because while the image of the masked figure on Nancy's porch provided the beginning of the timeline, the person did not simply vanish afterward. They had to leave the property. And leaving meant movement. Movement through streets that might contain cameras. Movement that might be recorded somewhere along the surrounding roads. Investigators reviewed hours of footage searching for vehicles that might correspond with the timeline of the disappearance. A car passing through the neighborhood shortly after 2:28 a.m. would immediately become a point of interest. But identifying a vehicle requires more than simply noticing it on camera. Investigators must examine multiple recordings, confirm the vehicle's path, determine whether it appears on other cameras. The process takes time. And in cases involving residential neighborhoods with limited overnight traffic, the number of vehicles may be small, but still difficult to analyze. Meanwhile, public attention on the case continued growing. The image of the masked figure remained central to the story. But investigators knew something the public sometimes overlooks. The person on the porch represented only part of the evidence. The real story of the case existed within the timeline created by technology, forensic analysis, and investigative work unfolding behind the scenes. Each new piece of information had to be evaluated carefully, each lead tested, each possibility considered, and sometimes the most dramatic clues turned out to be the least important. The glove discovered 2 miles from Nancy's home is an example of that. For a brief moment, it seemed like the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. But the DNA results told a different story. The object was unrelated, which meant the real answers still remained hidden somewhere within the evidence that truly connected to Nancy Guthrie's home. As the investigation continued, authorities also began examining the broader context of the disappearance, the timing, the location, the possibility that the crime had not been random. Because when investigators study cases involving targeted abductions, they often examine whether the victim was selected deliberately. Was Nancy chosen for a reason? Did the person approaching the house know who lived there? Did they know the layout of the property? Or had they simply chosen the house at random? Those questions would shape the next stage of the investigation, because while the search for physical evidence continued, investigators were also examining something else. The possibility that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had been planned. And if that possibility were true, it would raise a new set of questions. Questions about who might have had knowledge of the house. Questions about who might have known Nancy's routines. Questions about who might have known exactly when the quiet desert night would provide the perfect moment to approach her door. Those questions remain part of the investigation today, and they lead directly into the next chapter of the story. The point at which investigators began considering what they believed about the crime itself, and why they began suggesting that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance might not have been random at all. As the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance moved deeper into its second month, the picture investigators were assembling began to shift. Early in cases like this, law enforcement often keeps possibilities open. Runaway, medical emergency, voluntary disappearance. But as evidence accumulates, investigators begin narrowing the range of explanations. And in the case of Nancy Guthrie, the direction of the investigation gradually became clearer. Authorities began indicating that they did not believe Nancy's disappearance was random. Instead, they suggested something far more deliberate. Investigators began using a word that carries specific meaning in criminal investigations: targeted. When law enforcement describes a crime as targeted, it suggests that the victim was chosen, not simply encountered, not selected by chance, but specifically identified. In many cases, determining whether a crime was targeted requires examining the circumstances surrounding the event. The location, the timing, the actions of the person involved. In Nancy Guthrie's case, several factors led investigators to consider that possibility. First was the location itself. Nancy's home sat within a quiet residential area in the Catalina foothills. Not an isolated rural structure, not a property hidden far from neighbors. Instead, a house within a neighborhood where approaching a door in the middle of the night carries risk. Risk that someone might notice. Risk that cameras might capture movement. Risk that lights might activate. The person who approached Nancy's house did so anyway. That alone suggested a level of confidence. Second was the timing. The masked figure appeared on the porch at 1:47 a.m., a time when most of the neighborhood would have been asleep, a time when vehicle traffic would be minimal, a time when someone approaching the house might expect the lowest chance of being seen. Selecting that specific window could have been coincidence. But investigators also considered the possibility that the timing had been chosen deliberately. Third was the behavior of the individual captured on camera. The figure approached the house calmly, moved directly toward the doorbell camera, reached toward the lens, and the signals stopped. The movement did not appear hesitant. The person did not appear to be searching for an entrance. Instead, the figure moved with purpose. Those observations do not prove familiarity with the house, but they are consistent with someone who expected certain things to be present, such as the camera. And investigators often examine whether that kind of awareness suggests prior knowledge. Because crimes involving prior knowledge often unfold differently from crimes involving strangers. Someone familiar with a house may know where cameras are located, They may know which entrances are visible from the street. They may know when lights automatically activate. And they may know the routines of the person living inside. In Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators began studying the possibility that whoever approached the porch may have possessed some form of knowledge about the property. At the same time, investigators emphasized something important. Knowing that a crime may have been targeted does not immediately identify who committed it. Many people can possess knowledge about a location: neighbors, friends, delivery workers, maintenance personnel, visitors. Each of those possibilities must be considered carefully, which is why investigators continued examining evidence rather than drawing early conclusions. Meanwhile, forensic analysis remained underway. DNA samples collected from inside Nancy's home were undergoing laboratory examination. Those samples could potentially reveal whether someone else had been inside the house during the critical time window. DNA analysis can produce several outcomes. Sometimes a sample matches an individual already present in criminal databases. Sometimes it identifies someone known to investigators. And sometimes it produces an unknown profile. In recent years, unknown DNA profiles have sometimes been investigated using genetic genealogy. That technique allows investigators to compare DNA samples against public genealogy databases containing voluntarily submitted genetic information. If a partial match appears, investigators can begin constructing family trees. Eventually, those family trees can lead to individuals connected genetically to the unknown sample. The process can take time, but it has solved numerous cases that once appeared impossible. In Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators were reportedly exploring this option as part of the forensic investigation. At the same time, the search for additional digital evidence continued. Security cameras from surrounding streets were reviewed repeatedly. Traffic patterns were examined. Investigators attempted to reconstruct vehicle movement during the early morning hours of February 1st. One of the central questions remained unchanged. How did the person seen on Nancy's porch leave the area? Because unless the individual lived nearby, transportation would have been necessary, which meant a vehicle might appear somewhere along the surrounding roads. Identifying that vehicle could provide investigators with a powerful lead, but locating a single vehicle among many requires careful analysis. Video from multiple cameras must be compared. Timing must be verified. Vehicle characteristics must be studied. Color, shape, headlight patterns. Each detail becomes part of the investigation. Meanwhile, the public continued following every development closely. The image of the masked figure had already spread widely. News broadcasts replayed the footage repeatedly. Online discussions continued analyzing the person's height, posture, and clothing. But investigators consistently urged caution when interpreting the video, because surveillance footage rarely provides enough detail to identify someone with certainty. And misidentification can lead investigations in the wrong direction. As public interest intensified, the case also generated another familiar element of modern investigations: speculation. People began suggesting possible explanations, possible suspects, possible motives. Social media discussions examined every known detail. But investigators must separate speculation from evidence. Only verifiable information can guide an investigation, which is why law enforcement continued focusing on the evidence that could actually be tested: the timeline, the digital signals, the forensic samples, the surveillance footage. Those elements remained the foundation of the case. At the same time, investigators made another statement that captured public attention. They indicated that they believed they understood the motive behind the crime, but they did not reveal what that motive was. In criminal investigations, withholding details about motive can serve several purposes. It prevents potential suspects from adjusting their behavior based on public information. It protects investigative strategies, and it allows law enforcement to verify information provided by witnesses. If someone claims knowledge of a crime and mentions details that have not been publicly released, investigators can evaluate whether that information might be genuine. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the suggestion that authorities believed they understood the motive added another layer of intrigue, because it implied that investigators possessed information not yet shared with the public. Information that might explain why Nancy had been taken, But until that information is confirmed through arrests or charges, investigators rarely reveal it publicly. Which means for now, the motive remains undisclosed. Another unanswered question concerns whether the person seen on Nancy's porch acted alone. Abductions can be carried out by a single individual, but in some cases, multiple people are involved. One person approaching the property, another waiting in a vehicle, or assisting in transportation. Investigators have not publicly confirmed whether they believe more than one person participated in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, but they have indicated that the possibility of an accomplice has not been ruled out. The distinction matters, because crimes involving multiple participants often involve coordination, planning, communication, and the possibility that someone else might eventually come forward with information. For investigators, understanding whether the person on the porch acted alone remains an important question. But as of now, the evidence released publicly has not provided a definitive answer. And while investigators continued analyzing the evidence behind the scenes, another development began unfolding outside the investigation itself. Public attention turned toward individuals connected to Nancy's life. People who had interacted with her, people who had visited her home, people whose names appeared in media reports connected to the timeline of her disappearance. The next chapter of the story would explore how public speculation began intersecting with the investigation, and how investigators attempted to keep the focus where it belonged, on evidence. Because in high-profile cases, the difference between speculation and proof can become blurred quickly, and the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie would soon demonstrate just how powerful that distinction can be. In the weeks after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the investigation unfolded in two different places at the same time. One investigation was happening quietly, inside law enforcement offices, inside forensic laboratories, inside the evidence rooms where detectives reviewed timelines, digital signals, and surveillance footage frame by frame. But another investigation was unfolding publicly, across television broadcasts, across social media, across thousands of online discussions where people examined the same limited information investigators had released. When a case attracts national attention, that kind of public analysis becomes almost inevitable. Millions of people begin studying every image, every detail, every sentence released by investigators. Sometimes those conversations help. A viewer recognizes a vehicle. Someone identifies a location. A witness remembers something unusual. But other times the conversation moves faster than the evidence, and names begin appearing long before investigators have reached conclusions. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie soon entered that stage, because once the image of the masked figure on the porch spread across the country, people began searching for someone who might match that outline. The figure's height estimate, the clothing, the backpack, even the way the person walked, all of those details became points of comparison. Some viewers began analyzing the person's posture. Others compared the person's movement to videos of individuals connected to Nancy's life. Most of those comparisons were speculative. Security footage provides limited visual information. Camera angles distort proportions. Lighting hides details. But speculation can spread quickly once a story captures national attention. In the Nancy Guthrie case, one of the moments that intensified public discussion occurred on March 2nd. That day, members of Nancy's family gathered at a small memorial outside her home. Yellow flowers had been placed near the property. Handwritten notes appeared beside them. Messages expressing hope. Messages asking for Nancy's safe return. Among those visiting the memorial were Savannah Guthrie and her sister Annie. Walking beside them was Annie's husband, Tomaso Cion. For the first time since Nancy's disappearance, he appeared publicly with the family outside the house where she had vanished. Television cameras recorded the moment. Reporters watched as the three walked together toward the memorial. For many observers, it was simply a moment of family solidarity, a public show of support during an extraordinarily painful time. But online, the appearance quickly triggered discussion, because people began comparing images of Tomaso Cion walking beside the family with the footage of the masked figure captured on Nancy's porch. Side-by-side comparisons appeared across social media. Videos paused at specific frames. Screenshots examined posture, stride length. shoulder movement. Those comparisons generated intense debate. Some viewers believed the movements looked similar. Others argued that the comparisons were meaningless. Because security footage rarely provides enough clarity to make reliable conclusions about identity, investigators themselves never confirmed any such comparisons. Law enforcement repeatedly emphasized that speculation online should not be treated as evidence. Still, the moment illustrated something important about high-profile cases. When a mystery captures public attention, people naturally search for answers. And in the absence of confirmed suspects, some observers begin trying to solve the puzzle themselves. That process can sometimes produce useful information, but it can also produce misunderstandings, which is why investigators must rely on evidence rather than public interpretation. Another factor complicated the situation. Tomaso Cion had already been mentioned in public reporting for a specific reason. He was the last known person publicly identified as having seen Nancy alive on the evening of January 31st. That fact alone placed him within the timeline of the investigation, but being part of a timeline does not make someone responsible for a crime. Investigators routinely speak with individuals who had contact with victims shortly before crimes occur. Friends, family members, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might provide information about the victim's final hours. In Nancy Guthrie's case, authorities also stated publicly that family members had been cleared as suspects during the investigation. Despite that statement, speculation online continued. And as discussions spread, another name began appearing in conversations connected to the case: Dominic Evans. Evans was known publicly as a musician who had played in a band with Tomaso Cion for years. Online observers began examining photographs of Evans and comparing them with the description released by investigators. Height estimates, facial hair, the possibility of a marking on the wrist. Each detail became part of online debate. But once again, speculation moved faster than verified evidence. Evans himself later stated publicly that he had spoken with investigators and answered their questions. Law enforcement did not identify him as a suspect, and authorities continued emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing. Cases like this demonstrate a challenge that modern investigators frequently encounter: the speed of information. Images spread across the internet within minutes. Discussions expand across thousands of platforms. People from around the world examine the same footage, and interpretations multiply rapidly. But the responsibility of investigators remains the same. Evidence must be verified. Information must be tested. Conclusions must be supported by facts rather than assumptions, which means while public speculation continued, the actual investigation remained focused on the evidence: the digital timeline, the forensic analysis, the surveillance footage collected from surrounding streets. Those elements continued guiding the search for answers. Meanwhile, Nancy Guthrie remained missing. Every public discussion about the case ultimately returned to the same central question: where was she? Investigators continued urging anyone with information to contact authorities. The $1 million reward offered by the family remained in place. Search efforts continued, and behind the scenes, forensic work continued examining the evidence collected from Nancy's home. Because even while speculation captured headlines, the investigation itself was still unfolding. Slowly, carefully, and often out of public view, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie had already captured national attention. But the most important developments in the case were still happening quietly. Inside laboratories, inside investigative offices, inside databases where forensic evidence was being examined. Because eventually, one of those pieces of evidence may provide the answer investigators have been searching for since the morning Nancy was discovered missing. And that possibility leads to the final chapter of the story. The present moment in the investigation. What authorities believe now, and why, even after weeks of searching, the case of Nancy Guthrie remains one of the most unsettling mysteries still unfolding today. As of today, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains one of the most unsettling, unresolved cases in recent memory. Months have passed since the early morning hours of February 1st, when technology recorded the final known signals connected to her life. A camera that went dark, a pacemaker that stopped transmitting, A quiet house in the Catalina foothills suddenly becoming the center of a national investigation. Yet despite the passage of time, the essential timeline of that night remains remarkably clear. And that clarity is part of what makes the case so haunting, because investigators know precisely when something went wrong. 1:47 a.m. A masked figure appears on Nancy Guthrie's front porch. The person walks calmly toward the doorbell camera. A gloved hand reaches forward. The video feed disappears. 2:28 a.m. Nancy's pacemaker loses its connection. The device that had silently transmitted signals for years suddenly goes offline. Those 2 moments define the window in which Nancy Guthrie vanished. 41 minutes. Somewhere within that period, events unfolded that investigators are still trying to reconstruct, and the person captured on that camera remains unidentified. Authorities continue to emphasize that the investigation is active. Forensic analysis of evidence collected from Nancy's home continues. DNA samples remain under examination. Genetic genealogy techniques are being explored as a possible method of identifying unknown profiles connected to the scene. Investigators are also continuing to review digital evidence collected during the early stages of the investigation. Surveillance footage from surrounding streets, vehicle movement during the early morning hours, phone data connected to the area. Each of these elements may eventually reveal something investigators did not initially see. Cases involving missing persons sometimes move slowly. Weeks can pass without public updates, while forensic analysis continues quietly. New leads may appear long after the initial investigation begins, which is why authorities continue asking the public to remain attentive. Someone may remember something unusual from that night. A vehicle parked where it normally wouldn't be. A person walking through the neighborhood during the early morning hours. Even a small observation can sometimes become important once investigators place it into the timeline. Nancy's family continues living with the uncertainty that accompanies cases like this. They have publicly expressed both hope and determination that the investigation will eventually produce answers. The $1 million reward offered for information remains available. Anyone who provides credible information leading to Nancy's safe return or to the resolution of the case may qualify for that reward. But beyond the reward, the family continues emphasizing something more personal. They want to know what happened, because in missing person cases, the absence of answers can be more painful than almost anything else. Not knowing whether a loved one is safe, not knowing where they might be, not knowing what happened during those final hours. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance also illustrates something broader about modern criminal investigations. Technology has changed the way cases unfold. Devices like pacemakers, smart home cameras, and digital records now provide investigators with timelines that would have been impossible decades ago. But technology can only reveal certain pieces of the puzzle. It can show when a signal disappears. It can record a person approaching a door. It can track the moment a device goes offline. But technology cannot always reveal identity. And identity is the missing piece in this case. Who was the masked figure standing on Nancy Guthrie's porch at 1:47 a.m.? Why did that person approach her house? What happened during the 41 minutes after the camera went dark? And where is Nancy Guthrie now? Those questions remain at the center of the investigation. Authorities continue urging anyone with information to come forward. Even information that might seem insignificant could help investigators piece together the events of that night. If someone recognizes the clothing worn by the masked figure, if someone remembers a suspicious vehicle near the Catalina foothills neighborhood, if someone knows something they have not yet shared, investigators want to hear from them. Because in cases like this, answers sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places. A memory, a tip, a detail that suddenly makes sense when placed into the timeline. Until that moment arrives, the image of the masked figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch remains one of the most chilling images connected to the case. A person standing silently in the darkness, a hand reaching toward the camera, and then, nothing. If you want to support investigations like this, and help keep attention on cases that still need answers, make sure you like this video, and subscribe to True Crime Bond. Every new viewer helps keep stories like Nancy Guthrie's in the public eye. And sometimes the attention of the public is exactly what helps bring long-awaited answers to families still waiting. Because somewhere, someone may already know the truth. And one day, that truth may finally explain what happened during the 41 minutes that changed everything.